The sheriff stood in my driveway holding a piece of paper that would change everything. Her badge gleamed in the morning sun as she smiled that cold, calculated smile I had come to know so well. "This is a federal lawsuit," she said, waving the document like a weapon, "filed against you for destruction of public property." My hands trembled as I read the charges. Every single word was a lie. Every accusation was fabricated. But as I looked up at Sheriff Karen's satisfied expression, I realized something that sent ice through my veins. This was not about trees anymore. This was about power, and she had just made the biggest mistake of her career. For 15 years, my little corner of Cedar Creek had been everything I ever wanted. The 2-acre plot sat at the end of Maple Street, where the pavement turned to gravel and the city noise faded into birdsong. 3 magnificent oak trees lined my eastern fence, their branches reaching toward heaven like ancient guardians protecting my home. I had planted those trees myself when I first bought the property. Back then, they were just skinny saplings that barely reached my waist. Now they towered 40 feet high, their thick trunks testament to years of careful watering, fertilizing, and pruning. My neighbors often commented on how beautiful they looked, especially in autumn when their leaves turned brilliant shades of gold and crimson. But last March, the spring storms hit harder than anyone expected. 3 days of relentless wind and rain left damage throughout the county. When I walked outside to assess my property, my heart sank. The largest oak had several massive branches hanging at dangerous angles, one of them scraping against my roof with every gust of wind. Another branch had grown so close to the power lines that the electric company had already left a notice warning me to trim it immediately. I spent 2 weeks researching the proper way to handle the situation. I called 3 different tree services for quotes, checked my property lines twice, and even contacted the city planning office to make sure no permits were required for trimming trees on my own land. Everything checked out. The trees were completely within my property boundaries, at least 10 feet from the road, and the work fell under normal property maintenance. That Saturday morning in April started like any other weekend. I had my coffee on the back porch, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and orange. The tree service crew arrived at 8 o'clock sharp, professional and courteous. They set up their equipment carefully, laying protective tarps over my flower beds and positioning their truck to minimize impact on my lawn. I felt good about the decision. These trees meant everything to me, but keeping them safe meant keeping my home and family safe too. The crew leader explained each step of the process, showing me exactly which branches needed removal and how they would preserve the health and beauty of the trees. As the first branch came down, I noticed a figure watching from across the street. Sheriff Karen stood in the shadow of the Hendersons' mailbox, her arms crossed, her eyes fixed on my property with an intensity that made my stomach clench. I had seen her around town plenty of times, but we had never spoken. She was new to the position, appointed just 6 months earlier after Sheriff Williams retired. Something about her posture made me uncomfortable. This was not the casual interest of a neighbor wondering about tree work. This was surveillance. This was suspicion. This was trouble waiting to happen. I tried to shake off the feeling and focus on the tree crew's progress. They were doing excellent work, each cut precise and professional. But every time I glanced toward the street, Sheriff Karen was still there, still watching, still radiating an energy that felt more like a predator studying prey than a public servant ensuring community safety. At 10:30, Sheriff Karen crossed the street with the purposeful stride of someone who had already made up her mind about guilt and innocence. She wore her full uniform despite it being her day off, the gun, belt, and badge giving her an imposing presence that seemed designed to intimidate rather than reassure. "Excuse me," she called out in a voice that carried no politeness despite the words. "I need to speak with you about what you are doing here." I walked over with a friendly smile, still believing this would be a simple, neighborly conversation. Maybe she was concerned about noise, or wanted to make sure we were being safe with the equipment. "Good morning, Sheriff. Just doing some necessary tree maintenance after the storm damage. Beautiful day for it." Her expression did not soften. If anything, her eyes narrowed as she looked from me to the tree crew to the pile of cut branches. "Do you have permits for this work?" she demanded. The question caught me off guard. Permits? These are my trees on my property. The city planning office told me no permits are required for routine tree trimming. "That is not what I asked. I asked if you have permits." The hostility in her voice was unmistakable now. The tree crew had stopped working and were watching our exchange with obvious discomfort. I could feel my face flushing, partly from embarrassment and partly from growing anger. "No, Sheriff, I do not have permits because none are required. Would you like to see my property survey? The trees are well within my boundary lines." Karen stepped closer, her hand resting casually on her gun belt in a gesture that felt deliberately threatening. "I have received multiple complaints about destruction of city property," she said. "These trees may be protected under municipal ordinances that you are violating." My mouth fell open. Protected trees, municipal ordinances. I had lived here for 15 years and planted these trees myself. Every word out of her mouth was not just wrong but completely fabricated. "Sheriff, I think there has been some misunderstanding. I can show you the original planting receipts, the property survey, and the documentation from the electric company requesting this exact tree work. These trees have never been city property." She pulled out a small notebook and began writing, ignoring everything I had just said. "Name," she demanded. "I am sorry, what?" "Your full legal name. I am filing a report." The surreal nature of the situation hit me like a physical blow. Here I was, being treated like a criminal for maintaining my own property, by a sheriff who seemed determined to create problems where none existed. I gave her my name, watching in disbelief as she continued writing what appeared to be a very detailed report about something that was completely legal and justified. "I am going to need you to stop all work immediately pending investigation," she announced. "Investigation of what exactly?" "Destruction of municipal property and violation of city ordinances." The tree crew leader approached hesitantly. "Ma'am, we have all the proper insurance and certifications. This is standard tree maintenance work. We have done dozens of jobs like this throughout the county." Karen's head snapped toward him with laser focus. "Are you interfering with a police investigation?" The poor man stepped back like he had been slapped. "No, ma'am, I was just trying to explain." "I suggest you pack up your equipment before I decide. You are part of this violation." I watched in horror as professional tradesmen who had done nothing wrong began hastily loading their tools, clearly terrified of this woman's apparent authority to destroy their livelihoods on a whim. "Sheriff Karen," I said, fighting to keep my voice level, "I would appreciate if you would explain exactly what law you believe I am breaking." She closed her notebook with a sharp snap and looked at me with the kind of cold satisfaction that made my skin crawl. "You will find out when you receive your citation. Have a pleasant day." As she walked away, I stood in my driveway surrounded by half-finished tree work and the embarrassed silence of working men who had just witnessed an abuse of power so blatant it left everyone speechless. 20 minutes after Sheriff Karen left, 3 patrol cars pulled into my driveway with lights flashing, but no sirens. The display was clearly intended to draw maximum attention from every neighbor within a 2-block radius. I watched from my front window as officers emerged from their vehicles with the kind of coordinated precision usually reserved for drug raids or domestic violence calls. My heart was pounding as I opened the front door. This could not be happening. This could not be real. "Are you the homeowner?" asked the lead officer, a young man whose name tag read Deputy Martinez. "Yes, this is my property. What is this about?" "We have a report of illegal tree removal and destruction of city property. We need to see identification and documentation for this work." Behind Deputy Martinez stood 2 other officers, both with their hands resting on their gun belts. One of them was already taking photographs of my property, the tree crew's equipment, and the pile of trimmed branches. "Officers, there has been a serious misunderstanding. These are my trees on my private property. I have all the documentation you need right inside." "Sir, please remain where you are while we assess the situation," Martinez instructed. I stood on my own front porch, watching 3 armed police officers treat my property like a crime scene, while neighbors gathered on the sidewalk to witness my public humiliation. Mrs. Henderson from across the street was recording everything on her phone. The Johnsons had come out of their house and were whispering to each other while pointing in my direction. When I returned with my property survey, receipts, and electric company correspondence, Deputy Martinez reviewed the documents with the kind of skeptical attention usually reserved for suspected forgeries. "These trees are definitely on your property," he admitted after several minutes. "Yes, I planted them myself 15 years ago." "But Sheriff Karen filed a report stating you were removing protected municipal trees without permits." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Even as he said them, Deputy Martinez seemed to realize something was not adding up. "Deputy, with respect, Sheriff Karen's report is completely false. These have never been municipal trees. There are no permits required for this work. The electric company specifically requested that I trim these branches." Martinez looked uncomfortable. He glanced at his fellow officers, then back at the documentation in his hands. "I am going to need to make some phone calls," he said finally. While Martinez spoke quietly into his radio, the other officers continued their investigation of my property. They measured distances, took more photographs, and even examined the cut branches as if they were pieces of evidence in a murder case. The tree crew, meanwhile, sat in their truck looking like they wanted to disappear into the earth. They had been ready to finish the job and move on to their next appointment. Instead, they were trapped in what appeared to be some kind of police sting operation over routine tree maintenance. After 30 minutes of radio consultations and document review, Deputy Martinez approached me with obvious reluctance. "Sir, I have confirmed with the City Planning Office that no permits are required for this work, and these trees are clearly on your private property. However, Sheriff Karen has filed an official report, so we have to complete our investigation." "What does that mean exactly?" "It means we have to document everything and file our own report. The district attorney will review both reports and determine if any charges should be filed." I felt like I was living in an alternate reality, where basic property rights had been suspended, and reasonable people had been replaced by robots following incomprehensible programming. Charges for what? Maintaining my own property, trimming branches that were threatening my roof and power lines. Martinez looked genuinely sympathetic, but his hands were tied by procedure and hierarchy. I understand your frustration, sir, but we have to follow protocol when a sheriff files a formal complaint. As the officers finally prepared to leave, I stood in my driveway feeling violated in ways I had never experienced. My reputation in the neighborhood was probably destroyed. My simple tree maintenance project had become a public spectacle, and somewhere in town, Sheriff Karen was probably filing more paperwork to make my life even more miserable. The tree crew leader approached me as the patrol cars pulled away. "Sir, we are really sorry about all this. In 20 years of tree work, we have never had anything like this happen." "It is not your fault," I assured him, "but I understand if you need to leave." He shook his head. "We are going to finish the job. This is wrong and everyone knows it." That night I could not sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, diving deep into municipal codes, sheriff department regulations, and civil rights law. If Sheriff Karen wanted to play games with false reports and harassment, she had picked the wrong target. The first thing I discovered was that Cedar Creek's municipal tree ordinance was very clear and very limited. Protected trees were only those on public property or specifically designated heritage trees on private property. My oaks were neither. They were ordinary trees on private land, planted and maintained by me for 15 years. But the deeper I dug, the more disturbing patterns I found. A search of public records revealed that Sheriff Karen had been involved in 17 formal complaints in her 6 months in office. 17. Her predecessor, Sheriff Williams, had averaged 3 complaints per year over a 20-year career. The complaints painted a troubling picture. Karen had arrested a teenager for skateboarding in a parking lot where skateboarding was legal. She had cited a food truck owner for operating without permits that were not required. She had threatened to confiscate a man's hunting rifle because she claimed his license was expired, even though it was valid for another 8 months. Each case followed the same pattern. Karen would confront citizens engaged in perfectly legal activities, claim they were violating laws or ordinances that did not exist, and then file official reports when people challenged her authority. Most disturbing of all, every single complaint had been dismissed or ignored by the city council and the sheriff's internal affairs process. Karen faced no consequences, no retraining, no disciplinary action. She was learning that she could fabricate violations and harass citizens with complete impunity. At 2 o'clock in the morning, I found the case that changed everything. 3 months earlier, Karen had arrested an elderly man named Robert Chen for trespassing in a public park. According to her report, Chen was acting suspiciously and refused to show identification when questioned. She charged him with trespassing, resisting arrest, and interfering with a police investigation. The problem was that Chen had been feeding ducks with his granddaughter in a public park during normal operating hours. The suspicious activity was an elderly Asian man sitting on a bench with a 5-year-old child. The resisting arrest was Chen asking why he was being arrested when he had done nothing wrong. Chen spent 6 hours in jail before his lawyer secured his release. The charges were dropped after the park's security cameras proved that Chen had been doing exactly what he claimed. But the arrest remained on his record, and he was too frightened and financially drained to pursue civil action. I stared at Chen's mugshot on the computer screen, seeing my own future if I did not act. Karen was not just power-hungry. She was dangerous. She was systematically targeting anyone who questioned her authority, and she was using the legal system as a weapon of personal revenge. The next morning, I called the law office of Patricia Reynolds, an attorney who specialized in civil rights and police misconduct cases. I had found her name in several news articles about successful lawsuits against corrupt police departments. "Mr. Patterson," she said after I explained my situation, "what you are describing fits a very clear pattern of constitutional violations. The Fourth Amendment protects you from unreasonable searches and seizures. The 14th Amendment guarantees due process. Sheriff Karen appears to have violated both. What are my options?" "Several. We can file a complaint with the state attorney general's office. We can pursue a federal civil rights lawsuit under Section 1983. We can request a formal investigation by the state police. But first, we need to document everything and gather as much evidence as possible." Reynolds explained that cases like mine were most successful when they revealed systemic problems rather than isolated incidents. The more evidence we could gather about Karen's pattern of misconduct, the stronger our case would become. "There is something else you should know," she added. "Based on what you have told me and the public records I am seeing, Sheriff Karen may not be properly certified for her position. State law requires specific training and continuing education for sheriff's deputies. If she has been operating without proper certification, that creates additional liability for the department and the city." I left that meeting with a clear mission. This was no longer about tree trimming or even personal vindication. This was about protecting my community from a dangerous person who had been given too much power and too little oversight. Sheriff Karen had made this personal when she decided to lie on an official police report. Now I was going to make it legal. Patricia Reynolds moved fast. Within a week, she had filed a formal complaint with the State Attorney General's Civil Rights Division and requested copies of all reports filed by Sheriff Karen during her tenure. The process was methodical, professional, and completely by the book. Everything Karen's conduct was not. The first breakthrough came when we discovered that Karen had indeed been operating without proper certification. State law required sheriff's deputies to complete 40 hours of continuing education annually and pass certification exams every 3 years. Karen's last certification had expired 14 months earlier, meaning every arrest she had made, every report she had filed, and every official action she had taken was legally invalid. "This is bigger than harassment," Reynolds explained during our second meeting. "This is criminal impersonation of a police officer. Every person she arrested, every citation she issued, every report she filed, all of it was done while she was legally unauthorized to act as a law enforcement officer." But building the case required more than just pointing out Karen's lack of certification. We needed to document the pattern of abuse and gather evidence from other victims. I started with Robert Chen, the elderly man who had been arrested for feeding ducks. When I called him, his granddaughter answered the phone. "Grandpa does not like to talk about what happened," she said quietly. "It scared him very badly. He does not go to the park anymore." After some gentle persuasion, Chen agreed to meet with me and Reynolds at her office. He was a small, dignified man in his 70s who spoke softly, but with clear conviction about what had happened to him. "She called me a threat to public safety," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "I was sitting on a bench with my granddaughter, feeding ducks bread crumbs. She said I was acting suspicious because I would not immediately show her my identification." "Did you ask why she needed to see your identification?" Reynolds asked. "Yes. She said I was trespassing in a public park during daylight hours. When I explained that made no sense, she said I was resisting lawful orders. When I asked to speak to another officer, she said I was interfering with an investigation." Chen's story was identical to mine in every detail that mattered. Karen had confronted a citizen engaged in perfectly legal activity, fabricated violations that did not exist, and escalated the situation when her authority was questioned. "I spent 6 hours in a jail cell," Chen continued. 6 hours for feeding ducks with my granddaughter. They took my shoelaces and my belt. They fingerprinted me like a criminal, all because I asked a simple question about why I was being arrested. Reynolds and I exchanged glances. Chen's case was even stronger than mine because he had actually been arrested and jailed based on Karen's false report. Our investigation continued with the skateboarding teenager, Marcus Williams. He was 18 years old, fresh out of high school, and working part-time at the local grocery store while saving money for community college. "She told me skateboarding was illegal in the shopping center parking lot," Marcus explained. "But I had been skating there for 3 years. Lots of kids skate there. The store manager even said it was okay as long as we were not bothering customers." "What happened when you explained that to Sheriff Karen?" I asked. "She said I was arguing with a police officer and that she could arrest me for disorderly conduct. She took my skateboard and said she was confiscating it as evidence of illegal activity. She made me call my mom to come pick me up, like I was some kind of criminal." Marcus never got his skateboard back. Karen claimed it was being held as evidence, but when his mother tried to retrieve it through proper channels, she was told no such evidence existed in the department's custody. Each interview revealed the same disturbing pattern. Karen would confront citizens engaged in legal activities, claim they were violating non-existent laws, and then escalate the situation when people reasonably questioned her authority. She used the power of her badge and gun to intimidate people into compliance, knowing that most citizens would not have the knowledge or resources to challenge her later. But the most damaging evidence came from her own reports. Reynolds obtained copies through public records requests, and the inconsistencies were stunning. Karen's incident reports contained multiple factual errors, contradictory statements, and claims about city ordinances that simply did not exist. In my case, she had written that I was aggressively removing protected municipal trees without permits despite being warned to stop. Every single word of that statement was false and provably so. In Chen's case, she claimed he was acting suspiciously in a public area and became belligerent when questioned about his activities. The park's security cameras proved this was completely fabricated. "False police reports are felonies," Reynolds explained. "Each one of these reports contains multiple false statements made under oath. That is perjury. That is filing false instruments. That is abuse of office. Any one of these charges could end her career and send her to prison." The civil rights lawsuit was just the beginning. On a crisp Tuesday morning in September, Patricia Reynolds and I walked up the courthouse steps carrying a federal lawsuit that would change everything. The media was already waiting, alerted by a press release Reynolds had sent the night before. Local news crews, newspaper reporters, and even a stringer from the state capitol had gathered to cover what one headline would later call the Sheriff Karen scandal. The lawsuit was comprehensive and devastating. We were suing Sheriff Karen personally for civil rights violations, false imprisonment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We were suing the sheriff's department for inadequate supervision and failure to properly train their officers. We were suing the city for maintaining policies that allowed unqualified individuals to act as law enforcement officers. But more importantly, we were demanding a federal investigation into the entire department's practices and procedures. "This is not about one bad apple," Reynolds told the assembled reporters. "This is about a systemic failure of accountability that has allowed an unqualified individual to terrorize citizens while hiding behind a badge she was never legally entitled to wear. The story exploded across local media within hours. By evening, every television station in the region was running segments about the sheriff who was not really a sheriff. Social media lit up with citizens sharing their own encounters with Karen, many of them describing harassment and intimidation that had never been officially reported. The response from the sheriff's department was swift and predictably defensive. They issued a statement claiming that Karen was a dedicated public servant who has served the community with distinction, and that the lawsuit was a frivolous attack on law enforcement by disgruntled individuals. But their defense began crumbling almost immediately when reporters started asking basic questions about Karen's qualifications and certification status. The department's first response was that Karen's training was up to date and in full compliance with state requirements. When presented with evidence that her certification had expired over a year earlier, they claimed it was a paperwork oversight that has been corrected. The problem was that certification cannot be retroactively restored. Every official action Karen had taken, while uncertified, was legally invalid, creating potential liability for hundreds of cases. Within a week of filing the lawsuit, our phone was ringing constantly with calls from other victims. The food truck owner whose business had been shut down for non-existent permit violations. A young mother who had been cited for letting her children play in a public playground during legal hours. An elderly couple who had been threatened with arrest for walking their dog on a public sidewalk. Each story followed the same pattern, but together they painted a picture of systematic abuse that went far beyond individual misconduct. Karen had been operating like a feudal lord, making up laws as she went and enforcing them through intimidation and the threat of arrest. The turning point came when the local newspaper, the Cedar Creek Gazette, published a comprehensive investigation into Karen's background and hearing process. What they discovered was shocking even to those of us who had been documenting her misconduct. Karen had been hired not through a competitive process or based on her qualifications, but because she was the sister-in-law of City Councilman Bradley Morrison. Morrison had pushed for her appointment despite the fact that she had no prior law enforcement experience, no relevant education, and no certifications beyond a basic security guard license. Even more damaging, the Gazette revealed that Karen had been fired from her previous job as a mall security guard for excessive use of authority and inappropriate interactions with the public. The termination report, obtained through public records requests, described her as unsuitable for any position involving authority over others. The city had hired someone who had been deemed unfit to guard a shopping mall and given her a badge, a gun, and the authority to arrest citizens. Public outrage was immediate and intense. Citizens packed the next city council meeting, demanding answers about how Karen had been hired and why her obvious misconduct had been ignored for so long. Council members who had previously defended Karen now claimed they had been unaware of the full scope of the situation. But the most satisfying moment came when Karen herself tried to respond to the mounting criticism. In a disastrous television interview, she defended her actions by claiming that citizens need to respect authority and follow lawful orders, even if they do not understand the reasons. When the reporter asked her to explain the specific laws she had been enforcing, Karen became flustered and angry. She could not cite a single ordinance or statute that justified any of her actions. Instead, she fell back on vague claims about maintaining order and protecting the community. The interview went viral, shared thousands of times across social media, with commentary ranging from mockery to outrage. Karen had destroyed what little credibility she had left by demonstrating on live television that she had no understanding of the laws she claimed to be enforcing. The federal investigation began 2 weeks later. The state attorney general's office does not investigate small-town sheriff departments lightly. When they sent a team of investigators to Cedar Creek in October, everyone knew this was serious. The lead investigator, Detective Sarah Morrison, no relation to Councilman Morrison, had built her career prosecuting police corruption cases. Her reputation was impeccable and her methods were thorough. The investigation began with a comprehensive audit of every case Karen had handled during her tenure. Every arrest, every citation, every report, every use of force incident, all of it was reviewed by experienced investigators who knew what proper police work looked like. What they found was worse than anyone had imagined. In addition to the cases we had already documented, the investigation uncovered dozens of other incidents where Karen had acted outside her authority. She had conducted illegal searches of vehicles during routine traffic stops. She had detained citizens without probable cause. She had filed false reports to justify arrests that were made without legal basis. Most disturbing of all, she had been operating what investigators called a personal justice system, where her decisions about law enforcement were based on her personal opinions about citizens rather than actual violations of law. The investigation revealed that Karen had specifically targeted citizens who challenged her authority, questioned her decisions, or made complaints about her conduct. Robert Chen had been arrested not for trespassing, but for having the audacity to ask why she needed to see his identification. Marcus Williams had been harassed not for illegal skateboarding, but for politely explaining that skateboarding was allowed in the parking lot. I had been targeted not for illegal tree removal, but for calmly showing her documentation proving that her accusations were false. This represents a complete breakdown of constitutional policing, Detective Morrison explained during a press conference. Citizens were being arrested and harassed not for violating laws, but for exercising their constitutional rights to question authority and demand accountability. But the investigation did not stop with Karen's individual misconduct. The state team also examined the department's supervision, training, and accountability systems. What they found was a department that had completely failed in its basic responsibilities. Karen's supervisor, Lieutenant Davis, admitted under questioning that he had never reviewed any of her reports, never accompanied her on patrol, and never provided any oversight of her activities. When asked about the numerous citizen complaints against Karen, Davis claimed he had never seen them. The investigation revealed that complaint forms were routinely lost or never forwarded to appropriate supervisors. Citizens who tried to file complaints were often discouraged or told that their concerns would be addressed informally. No formal investigation had ever been conducted into any complaint against Karen, despite state law requiring such investigations. Even more damaging, the department had no system for tracking officer certifications, training requirements, or continuing education. No one in the department knew that Karen's certification had expired. No one was monitoring whether officers were qualified to perform their duties. This department was operating without any meaningful oversight or accountability, Detective Morrison reported. Officers were essentially free to act however they chose, with no supervision, no training, and no consequences for misconduct. The financial implications were staggering. Every arrest Karen had made, while uncertified, was potentially subject to civil rights lawsuits. Every conviction based on her testimony could be overturned. Every citation she had issued could be challenged in court. The state estimated that the city faced potential liability exceeding $2 million in civil rights violations alone, not counting the cost of retrials, overturned convictions, and administrative remedies. But the most dramatic revelation came when investigators examined Karen's hearing process in detail. The background check that should have revealed her termination from the mall security job had never been completed. The certification verification that should have confirmed her qualifications had never been performed. The psychological evaluation that was required for all law enforcement officers had never been conducted. Karen had been hired based entirely on Councilman Morrison's personal recommendation, with no verification of any of her claimed qualifications or background. When confronted with this evidence, Morrison initially denied any wrongdoing. He claimed that Karen had been the most qualified candidate and that her hearing had been completely proper and above board. But investigators had obtained emails between Morrison and Karen dating back 6 months before her hearing, in which they discussed opportunities in law enforcement and Morrison's ability to make things happen if she was interested in a career change. The emails made clear that Karen's hearing had been arranged as a personal favor, with no regard for public safety or legal requirements. Morrison had essentially created a law enforcement position for his sister-in-law, and then used his political influence to ensure she got it regardless of her qualifications. On November 15th, the state attorney general's office released its final report. The conclusions were devastating and unambiguous. The Cedar Creek Sheriff's Department has operated in systematic violation of state law, constitutional requirements, and basic standards of professional law enforcement. The department has failed to provide adequate supervision, training, or accountability for its officers. The hearing and retention of unqualified personnel has created substantial risk to public safety and constitutional rights. The report recommended immediate termination of Sheriff Karen, criminal prosecution for multiple felony violations, and complete restructuring of the department under state supervision. But the most significant recommendation was the one that would finally deliver justice: revocation of the department's charter and dissolution of their law enforcement authority. December 3rd was the day justice finally arrived in Cedar Creek. The State Review Board met in emergency session to consider the Attorney General's recommendation to revoke the Sheriff Department's law enforcement charter. I sat in the front row of the hearing room, watching as months of investigation and documentation culminated in official accountability. The hearing was devastating for Karen and the department. Detective Morrison presented evidence of systematic constitutional violations, criminal misconduct, and complete failure of supervision and training. The review board members asked pointed questions that made clear they had already reached their conclusions. In 30 years of law enforcement oversight, the board chairman stated, I have never seen such a comprehensive breakdown of professional standards and legal compliance. This department has operated more like a criminal organization than a law enforcement agency. Karen attended the hearing with her own attorney, still maintaining her innocence and claiming she had been the victim of a politically motivated witch hunt. Her testimony was painful to watch. She could not explain her expired certification, could not justify any of her false reports, and could not provide coherent answers about basic law enforcement procedures. When asked to explain the legal basis for my arrest over tree trimming, she claimed she had been enforcing municipal environmental protection ordinances. When the board chairman asked her to cite the specific ordinance, she could not do so because it did not exist. When asked about Robert Chen's arrest for feeding ducks, she claimed he had been acting suspiciously in a public area. When asked to define suspicious behavior, she said, refusing to cooperate with law enforcement. When asked what crime she suspected Chen of committing, she had no answer. The vote was unanimous. The Cedar Creek Sheriff's Department charter was revoked effective immediately. All law enforcement functions would be transferred to the county sheriff's office pending establishment of a new, properly supervised department. Karen was officially terminated and banned from holding any law enforcement position in the state. Criminal charges were filed including perjury, filing false reports, civil rights violations, and criminal impersonation of a police officer. Councilman Morrison faced federal corruption charges for his role in Karen's hearing and the subsequent cover-up of her misconduct. He resigned from the city council the day after the hearing. The civil rights lawsuit was settled for $350,000, with the money coming from the city's insurance policy and emergency funds. But more importantly, the settlement required comprehensive reforms including citizen oversight, mandatory training, and transparent complaint procedures for any future law enforcement operations. 3 months later, I received a call from Patricia Reynolds with news that made all the stress and effort worthwhile. Karen had been sentenced to 18 months in federal prison and 3 years probation. She would never again have the authority to harass innocent citizens or abuse the power of a badge. But the most satisfying moment came on a warm spring morning, exactly 1 year after Karen had first confronted me about my trees. I was in my backyard, admiring the healthy new growth on my oaks, when my neighbor Mrs. Henderson came over to chat. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "I thought you were making too big a deal about the tree situation. I did not understand what was really happening until I saw all the other stories come out." "You do not need to apologize," I assured her. "Most people want to trust law enforcement. Karen took advantage of that trust." Mrs. Henderson nodded thoughtfully. "I am glad you fought back. I am glad you did not just let it slide. Someone needed to stop her before she hurt more people." As I looked at my beautiful oak trees, their branches reaching toward the sky without threat to power lines or roof, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this moment.